So the next speaker is Jeff Frankel from Harvard University. Jeff.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here and have the opportunity to comment on these 4 papers, all of which I recommend. They're written in a punchy way, and they're worth reading. I'm going to organize my comments along the lines of Niels Tigathen's paper, because I think it's kind of a useful timeline, which is go back 30 years, 20 years, and 10 years, well, 1970, 1990, and 2010, so 40, 20, and today. So to begin with, 1970, the issues according to the original optimum currency area theory that was introduced by Mundell and McKinnon in the 1960s. That'll be the first thing I talk about. The second thing I will talk about will be to follow him, to talk about how the issues appeared to those that were drafting the Maastricht Treaty, for example, in the Delors report and in the study One Money, One Market, One Money, which was quite influential, and then come up to the present. The issues as they appear in light of recent developments, in particular the sovereign debt crisis in the periphery countries, and are the reforms that are currently being made the right ones? That's the outline. So let's start briefly with the original optimum currency area theory, which has given this session a part of its title. The idea, I mean, it's familiar to most of the audience probably, for the gains of a common currency to be worth the cost of giving up independent national monetary authorities, the countries must have a set of criteria: symmetric shocks, labor mobility, fiscal transfers, openness, high ratio of trade to GDP. I'm not going to elaborate on these. They're pretty familiar. It's often been noted by Europeans that a majority of American economists from the beginning have been skeptical of whether the euro would succeed. And an easy way of stating that skepticism is that many economists, especially Americans, have been concerned that maybe Europe lacks these OCA requirements. Okay, fast forward 10 years. The issues as they appear to those drafting the Maastricht Treaty. Well, here's a quote from Niels Tigathen. The background had changed remarkably. The implicit advice from the OCA checklist seemed less relevant, partly because it was more likely to evolve favorably after introducing a common currency than before. And I think this is probably related to what Wendy was just saying about endogeneity of the optimum currency area criteria. And I'm pleased to hear that this influenced thinking, whether it turned out to be right or wrong, because there was research to validate this judgment that monetary unions boost trade, the famous paper by Andy Rose, One Money, One Market, and that in turn the cyclical correlation rises. And then the part that's missing is people on the bottom who said that labor markets would be forced to become more competitive and flexible as a result of this. I never quite believed that one myself, but anyway. But as a result, the drafters of Maastricht emphasized different criteria than the traditional optimum currency area one. Now, the one that seems to me overwhelmingly, the big one that came in then, was the heart of the Maastricht criteria, the fiscal criterion, the ceilings on the budget deficit and on debt to GDP. Fiscal criteria like these had appeared nowhere, as far as I know, in any writings in the area of optimum currency area theory. One might have even said that if you've lost a national monetary instrument, it's all the more important to have the free use of a fiscal policy instrument. And there were some economists who said this was just completely incomprehensible. I'm citing here Bowder, Corsetti, and Rubini. Well, I think the motivation for the Maastricht fiscal criteria is pretty clear. Maybe it wasn't clear to us economists at the time. There were all kinds of theories that the Germans are doing this so that no one can succeed in doing it. It's like the golden fleece. You're meant to fail. Or it's just a good excuse to do something we should do anyway. But I think in retrospect, and it should have been clear at the time, the motivation is the same as for the no bailout clause and the Stability and Growth Pact. Skeptical German taxpayers believed and told their elites, before this is over, you're going to have us paying the bill for some profligate Mediterranean country that needs to be bailed out. And the European elites adopted these fiscal criteria to render the fiscal rules, to render those fears groundless, to say it's not true. And they spent the 10 years leading up to EMU and the 10 years after it saying it wasn't true. After the euro came into existence, I think it became clear that the German taxpayers were right. The elites weren't right, the economists weren't right, the German taxpayers were the ones who were right. For example, Greece, even on the figures which are now thought to have been incorrect, it did not meet the criteria a single year, not counting the year in which it joined. The large countries violated the rules too, and I've looked at forecasts. So the way the government agencies satisfied the Maastricht criteria when they missed them would be to forecast overly optimistically for the next year that they were going to come back and hit them. The penalties had zero credibility, and yet every year there were these reforms. They modified the SGP and said, this time we're really serious. The ostrich elites dug their heads deeper and deeper into the sand. Well, let's go to 2010, lessons from what happened. It was, as I recall, approximately January of 2010, very end of 2009, early 2010, that the sovereign debt problem became serious in Greece. Niels concludes that responsibility for financial stability cannot remain exclusively at the national level, as my words, and the same for fiscal stability, and I agree with that, and I imagine that that is something that most of the panel would agree with. I do not agree that the official responses have been the right ones. I agree with some of my fellow panelists, the paper by Darvis, Pisani, Fari, and Sapir. Officialdom has been reactive rather than proactive, treating insolvency as liquidity, and Kevin O'Rourke, German voters don't want a transfer union, and you saw the poll results and all that. So, I mean, it seems to me that after 10 years or more of telling the German taxpayers you're wrong, and then it turns out they're right, it's not auspicious time to say, well, now we're going to have a fiscal union. So the revisions in EMU governance, not just EMU, that's Brussels on the left and Frankfurt on the right, both. I'm taking these are quotes from Niels' paper. That it sounds more optimistic than I feel like we could be. Fiscal rules will become more explicit, monitored more tightly. The weaknesses in the SGP are now being addressed. We're also going to do structural reforms, EU-level supervision of financial institutions, the ESRB, the European Stability Mechanism. You know, we're fixing all this. I guess the one phrase that I'm really going to tweak him on, the loans to Greece in May 2010 and to Ireland were regarded as constructive by most critics. I'm not sure about that. So my reaction is the ostriches are just sticking their heads deeper and deeper into the sand, so far that maybe they've popped out the other side and come up on some other planet. There is less reason today to think that the SGP or some reformed version will work than there was in the first time around. It's very hard. It's not just Europe, it's true anywhere. It's very hard for one country to impose serious conditionality on their neighbors. That's what we have the IMF for, is my view. So I'm going to conclude. I've got 3 more slides, 2 important ones. This is one of them. European elites, in my view, made 4 big mistakes in managing the Greek debt problem. And I'm concentrating on Greece here because it was the outlier in terms of its fiscal profligacy. The others I actually have a lot of sympathy with. First, it was a mistake to admit Greece to the euro in the first place, and Greeks I've talked to think the same thing. Second, and here's something very specific that I want to focus on. In my view, at least in retrospect, it was a mistake for the ECB to accept Greek bonds as collateral, despite the high deficits and the deficits and the fact that they kept missing the fiscal criteria. And I think that's probably a big part of the reason why investors charged spreads for Greek debt that were almost zero. I'll show you a graph in a second. That Greece and the other Mediterranean countries could borrow at virtually the same interest rates as Germany, which is kind of nuts. Third mistake, failure to send Greece to the IMF in early 2010. The reaction was, no, 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 it's unthinkable. We wash our own dirty line. We take care of these things internally. That, I think, was misguided. And similarly, that it was unthinkable to have restructuring. I think by now, quietly, they're thinking about it, but early on, no, we can't even think about it, can't even talk about it. And I'm one of many who thinks that Greece will eventually have to restructure. Here's the graph. Before EMU, countries with high debt, like Greece and the others, had to pay spreads. And we heard from Carl Ludwig how US states, we saw a graph of the extreme case, but US states that borrow a lot, that have too high debt, they have to pay higher interest rates. And that is a disciplining mechanism. When Greece joined, like the others, it had to, its spreads came down a lot, to zero essentially, and didn't come back up until 2008, which I think is a big part of the problem. All right, what do I propose? And this is my last slide, so I know I'm almost out of time. What alternative fiscal reforms then would I propose? And taking as given that hopes of political union or fiscal union or transfer union, I think, are not on. My proposal, first, the SGP should emulate Chile's successful fiscal institutions. Someone yesterday put up a picture of Andres Velasco, and I've just written a paper trying to explain what it is that Chile has accomplished, how impressive it is that they now have countercyclical fiscal policy, and how the system works, and how I think it can be emulated by others. And by the way, in the US, the last 10 years, we've screwed up worse than anyone. And here's how the Chile's fiscal system goes. First, phrase the budget target in structural terms. It's no good to say you just absolutely have a limit. You can't run a deficit in a recession. That's too rigid. It's bad for the country. And even if you want to be a tough guy on discipline, it's not credible. You're not going to do it when the time comes. And I think that's understood in Europe. Second, and this is where what Chile has done really is a unique innovation that I think others could emulate. Give responsibility for determining whether a deficit is structural or cyclical, and whether a boom or bust is structural or cyclical, to an independent professional agency to avoid forecast bias, because the official forecasts are biased systematically. And this is the bottom of my slide. What happens when a country misses its target? And here's where I haven't heard anyone else say this before. I propose that when a country's deficit or debt is above the target, the only way to make it automatic, ECB stops accepting its bonds as collateral, then the sovereign spreads rise with true automaticity, and that enforces the discipline. This is an emu on the left, this is an ostrich on the right.
Thanks, Jeff.